We're talking elevated horror at the Horror Movie Syllabus.
I don't think that's what it means.
Now, alright, well, help me get down then. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Horror Movie Syllabus. I'm Professor Victor, and I will be your host as we go through all of the essential, noteworthy, interesting, and downright notorious modern horror films. If you're new to the Horror Movie Syllabus, I highly recommend that you check out our introduction video. There's a link to that in the description below, and it'll give you a pretty good idea of how things work here at the Horror Movie Syllabus. But in short, what we do is we take a particular subgenre of horror and we pick 3 representative movies for that subgenre to examine. Today, the subgenre that we're talking about is elevated horror, and this is going to be pretty interesting for a number of reasons. Now, I'm pretty excited about this because I love elevated horror movies, and I've really been enjoying this horror renaissance of what they're calling elevated horror, these movies that are just right up my alley, frankly. But what is elevated horror, and why is it so controversial? Well, it's not an easy thing to explain. So I actually did a little bit of research on this, and turns out there's not really a clear consensus on what constitutes elevated horror, or rather what the definition of elevated horror should be. For the most part, everybody seems to be in agreement that elevated horror references horror movies that are above the standard horror movie, hence the name. But above in what way? In terms of quality, in terms of meaning, in terms of importance? That's where there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of consensus, and I think that's where some of the controversy or debate comes from. The way I look at elevated horror, the definition that I'm going to use for it, is that it's horror movies that are made a little bit higher quality than your standard horror fare, and usually try to tackle deeper themes or deeper concepts, usually through allegories or sometimes just straight out. But tackling, real world issues or real world problems or real world emotions and feelings in a way that is maybe more meaningful or deeper than the standard, say, slasher movie. More on that in a second. And I also think that they tend to have a certain art house feel to them. For better or for worse, they feel kind of like artsy movies. So that's what I think elevated horror is. And I do think that a lot of the definitions of elevated horror out there align with some of, if not most of, what I just said. And I do think that's where the controversy comes from. I think that the people that don't like the term elevated horror, or actually flat out say that the subgenre doesn't exist, are bothered by what elevated horror denotes, or rather the implication of what it means for anything that's not elevated horror. In short, I think that people that don't like elevated horror feel like it's an insulting term. I think they think that it means that other subgenres are not smart or not important or not well made. And I get that. I think that that's a fairly reasonable issue to take with the definition. I mean, let's be clear. Any good horror fan will have to confess that a movie like Leprechaun in Space is not exactly a quality or artsy film by any stretch of the imagination. It's schlock, but it doesn't make it not fun, That said, just because a movie doesn't meet the definition of elevated horror, whatever definition it is you choose to apply, doesn't mean that it's not a quality film, doesn't mean that it's not important, doesn't mean that it doesn't have something to say or something, some sort of message or deeper meaning. And I think that's where some of the offense comes from. I think you could take a look at something like, say, Friday the 13th and say, that's not elevated horror. And I don't think anybody's going to argue that. But then you could take a movie like Halloween, which Friday the 13th rips off, and say Halloween's not elevated horror. And now you have a debate. A pretty interesting debate, actually. Feel free to discuss in the comments below. But could Halloween be considered elevated horror? And if not, would something like It Follows be considered elevated horror? Because many people do consider that elevated horror. Spoiler alert, it's not going to make the list here. Um, it'll make the list somewhere else. But you see the complexity of the elevated horror subgenre. Fortunately, the horror movie syllabus has a solution to all this, and it aligns with our general mission, which is all are welcome. I'm never going to say elevated horror is not a true horror subgenre because I like to be more inclusive rather than exclusive. I'm not into the whole horror gatekeeping thing. I embrace elevated horror. That said, I can understand why people would feel like it can be exclusionary itself. These movies over here are important and smart, and everything else is not. Well, at the horror movie syllabus, as you know, there's a lot of overlap between subgenres. And just because a movie is elevated horror doesn't mean it's not also, say, a zombie movie or a ghost movie, etc. And the inverse is also true, obviously, that just because a movie is, say, a vampire movie doesn't mean it's not also elevated horror. We talked about other movies in the past that would be considered elevated horror, and we'll be talking about some other ones in the future. I'll go ahead and name a couple right now that are widely considered to be elevated horror movies. Get Out and Hereditary are often cited as elevated horror movies. We're not talking about them in this video because we're talking about them in other subgenres. So that illustrates to you the fluidity of the horror genre, that just because something's elevated horror doesn't mean that it is not another kind of horror as well. And just because something's another kind of horror doesn't mean it wouldn't qualify as elevated horror. Again, you can make a case that Halloween is elevated horror, and that came out in 1978, and it's a slasher film. So I don't think people have to get too caught up on the elevated horror label. Everybody's welcome here. If somebody wants to call something elevated horror, great. If somebody doesn't like that term, that's fine too. What is important is the movies, and the movies by and large tend to be really, really, really good. They hit Professor Victor in the sweet spot. I've talked before on this channel that I really like these movies that set a certain atmosphere or have a sense of dread, something that really gets under your skin in favor of jump scares. And that's what the elevated horror movies tend to do. And this would be, I guess, an argument against, say, Halloween being elevated horror, is that elevated horror movies tend to, as a trope, eschew jump scares in favor of just a sense of dread and atmosphere. Now, you could also make an argument for Halloween for the same reason. Again, I don't want to go off on these Halloween elevated horror. Maybe that's another video. Let me know if you guys think that would be a video worth making. But the elevated horror movie generally focuses more on creeping you out rather than making you jump out of your seat. And I tend to favor those kinds of movies. Nothing against a good jump scare. I don't. I'm not one of those people that thinks a jump scare is not right. No, I like a good jump scare too. I just like anybody else. But these are the movies that tend to really kind of stick with me. Jump scare, I feel it's forgotten 10 seconds later. You're over it. But the movies we're going to talk about today will hang with you a little bit, and that's why I enjoy them so much. Speaking of the movies that we're going to talk about today, as usual, they're categorized as undergraduate, graduate, and postgraduate level. And today they're going to be organized in the order of how much I like them. But, and I've said this before, and it bears repeating, I love all of these movies. So the gradation between them, the differences between them to put them in order is so slim. They're all excellent, excellent movies. For the most part, even the extra credit movies I really enjoy. We'll get to that. But I really, really love these movies. They all are high recommends from me. So take it with a grain of salt, the order that they're in. I put them in the order in which I do like them the most. But you can shuffle these, and I wouldn't even argue with you about how the order you shuffled them in. So with that, let's go ahead and get right into these movies. The first movie we're talking about today, the undergraduate level movie, is Us. Now, I just mentioned Get Out a few minutes ago, and Us is the follow-up feature from horror director Jordan Peele, and I'm going to call him horror director Jordan Peele because he's made two incredible horror films as of the date of this recording, and he seems like he's locked in for more. Jordan Peele, if you don't know, is part of the comedy duo Key and Peele, who did skit comedy several years back, maybe about 10 years ago, maybe more, and he's funny, but I never really paid much attention. I'm more of a Chappelle guy personally, but I didn't pay attention to him until Get Out came out. And we're going to talk more about Get Out in the future, but Suffice to say, Get Out made a really big impact, not just on me, but on the entire horror genre and the world. It was a very commercially successful movie. His follow up, Us, was likewise very commercially successful and a big hit. Um, and you can debate which one of the two you think is better. I'd probably push the Get Out button, but that is not to undercut Us by any stretch of the imagination because it is a phenomenal movie. If you're not familiar with Us, it is the story about a family that goes to their vacation home and winds up being stalked or antagonized by another family that seems to be identical to them. And of course, hijinks abound. The movie is unsettling, to say the least. Like Get Out, you might have expected Us to have a really big comic bent because of Jordan Peele's involvement, because he's known for comedy. You might have expected it to be something more like Tales from the Hood or something like that. But it's not. It really does play it pretty straight. It's got moments of humor in it. It's got some charm in it for sure. It's a really balanced movie in that regard. But it's definitely a straight horror film. And it's part of why it would qualify for elevated horror. You don't see a lot of elevated horror movies being comedies. Um, Us is a complex movie, and it deals with themes of race and identity and social politics, socialism, things like that, slavery, really heavy subjects in a way that is scary and intriguing, but admittedly doesn't make a lot of narrative sense. There's holes in the narrative if you're trying to poke at it. So if you haven't seen it and you're going to see it, I would recommend trying to leave that alone. Just enjoy the ride and don't try to poke too much holes in the realism or the plausibility of the plot, because I think it's an allegory. I think the point of the movie is to tackle these uncomfortable subjects in a way that we can be a little bit more comfortable. Which is what I think horror does extremely well. We talked a little bit about this in the comments below. I think it was Spencer who brought up the issue that horror is well suited for tackling social issues because it does so in a kind of a safe space way where you can look at it and not feel the usual knot that you feel tackling or exploring these subjects. You can do it in a way that's a little bit more, dare I say, fun or at least diverting, and yet still kind of teach or give a message to it. And I do think that Us is a bit of a message movie, and we generally don't try to get too political here on the channel, and we won't here. I don't think this movie makes any kind of political statement that should really be offensive or polarizing. I don't think. I don't know. It might be my own biases that kind of cloud me to that, but I don't think so. I think that anybody can watch this movie and have a good time with it. I don't think that people are going to feel like they're being preached to, and that seems to be oftentimes the issue people have with message movies or political themes in movies, that they're getting preached to. I don't think that Us is a preaching movie by any stretch of the imagination. I think that's part of what makes Jordan Peele so masterful as a writer and director, is that he finds a way to deliver these his ideas in a way that is fun and entertaining and not preachy or overbearing. It's really quite masterful, and he deserves all the praise. I mean, he's an Academy Award nominated director and screenwriter, so by all means, he deserves those accolades because he's brilliant. And Us is a great example of his brilliance. Another thing about the movie that is worth mentioning is the brilliance of the acting. In particular, Lupita Nyong'o, who you may be familiar with from 12 Years a Slave or Star Wars. She's been in a lot of things. She's been nominated for Oscars herself. And she is phenomenal. I'll be honest, I was never 100% on the Lupita train until I saw this movie. Now I am a huge Lupita fan, and I'd basically be willing to watch just about anything that she's in. She's that good in this movie. She Well, I can't tell you too much about why she's so good in this movie without spoiling it too much. I can tell you that she plays two roles because that's in the trailer, and that's the premise of the movie is these identical family thing that's happening, these doppelgangers, if you will. And she's playing two different roles, and so the nuance between the two roles is fabulous to watch. But even just her primary role, she's so charming and likable and interesting, and there's so much depth and there's so much emotion in the face and in the eyes. She's phenomenal. Winston Duke, who plays her husband, you probably know him from Black Panther. He is also phenomenal. He's really funny. He's also very charming. He is really kind of turning the table on its heads a little bit because he's kind of like the nerdy dad, but he's a big hulking figure also, and it's a nice flip on the tropes. In fact, the whole movie is a bit of a flip on the tropes. I mean, in standard horror movies, and we'll talk about this in the future in other videos, the black people don't fare so well in your typical horror movies, especially from the 70s and 80s, and even the 90s. And this movie flips that on its head because the black family is your protagonist. It's who you're following. And that's refreshing. It's a nice change of a kind of a stale horror trope. I'd be remiss, by the way, if not throwing out a shout out to Elizabeth Moss, who's in the movie as well. Smaller role, but as always, Elizabeth Moss crushes it. She's really good. Across the board, everybody, the kids, everybody in the movie is doing grade A work. And it's important because any one of them not bringing their A game is going to take you right out of this movie because the movie's premise is strange. When you start it, you're going to think it's a weird mystery. You're going to have a hard time following. You're not going to be sure what's going on. That's okay. Just go along for the ride. It will all come together in a really good way. But it does deliver on the creeps. And that's the other thing that I think is really important. It gives you that creep factor really well. It's got themes of home invasion, and supernatural themes into it, slasher aspects to it. It's got all kinds of different aspects where I could have stuck us in many different subgenres. I chose to stick it here because I do think that some of the messages that it's exploring, some of the themes, especially the themes of race and class. Class more than anything. I don't think I mentioned that earlier on, but the class struggle is something that's really explored in this movie in a really bizarre and interesting way that again doesn't feel preachy, feels like a mystery and like a strange allegory, and I love it. I absolutely love the movie. I think it's brilliant. I think it's a lot of fun, and I think that anybody could enjoy this movie, regardless of what side of the aisle you fall on politically, regardless of whether or not you're American. I think that you'd find this movie really enjoyable, really entertaining. Maybe not totally easy to follow, but I think that if you, like I said, if you just kind of like stop trying to focus on narrative holes, I think you'll enjoy the ride very, very much. So if you haven't seen the movie, I would definitely recommend you check it out. And of course, if you have seen it, I'd love to hear what you think about it in the comments below. If you have a different take than I do, let's discuss in the comments because I do appreciate everybody sharing their own viewpoints on this thing. But I find us to be very interesting, very fun, high quality, and a good representation of what the elevated horror movie should be. The next movie that we're going to talk about, our graduate level movie, it's The Babadook. Now, The Babadook came out in 2014, and it was one of those horror movies that got a lot of critical acclaim and a lot of buzz. Never exactly broke out into the mainstream. It wasn't quite the commercial hit that something like Us was, or Get Out, for example. But it has this reputation that I think goes beyond cult status. I think that it's gotten not quite bona fide horror classic yet, but I definitely think that it's grown beyond cult status, and we'll get into why in just a minute. If you're not familiar with The Babadook, it's the story of a woman and her young child who is coping with the loss of her husband, and her child is difficult to deal with, and he comes across a storybook, a kid's book, about a creature called the Babadook that may or may not be tormenting this family. And we'll stop there because, as usual, I don't want to give too much away. Now, The Babadook is an Australian film by a woman named Jennifer Kent, and I think it was her first movie. I think it's her directorial debut or her feature debut. Um, and she crushes it. The movie is incredibly well made. I talked in the intro of this video about elevated horror tending to be of a higher quality than the standard horror movie. And while I understand that can be a kind of a controversial statement to say that, it kind of implies that other horror movies are low quality, and many of them are not. Um, there is a certain feel to some of these movies, and in particular The Babadook, that has this art house feel. It has this look to it, and camera movements and camera angles and lighting that evoke some sort of artistic impression. It's not just pointing and shooting or anything like that. And this is, again, not to say that other horror movies don't do this, but I do think that it tends to be a trope of the elevated horror movie. You can expect there to be a higher standard of quality, a better eye, if you will, being used to frame the movie. Jennifer Kent has that eye. But the movie works in particular because of the lead actress, who I did not write her name down, and I'll just put it down right here, I guess. She holds this movie together. This movie works only because her performance is incredibly powerful. It's raw and honest and kind of fearless, to be honest with you. The emotions that she explores and some of the themes that she's tackling are challenging, controversial. I don't know how you want to say it without spoiling, but she has to go into some really really interesting places, and it's powerful. It really is. And she's paired with a child actor who, I'll be honest with you, is really annoying, and that's kind of the point. He's supposed to be annoying, and so you can watch this woman fray at the edges. It's good stuff, man. It really is. And it dovetails really nicely into the themes this movie's trying to explore, which is themes of grief and mental illness. And those are heady themes. Those are tough subjects to face. And the Babadook does it in a way that introduces a supernatural element that becomes allegorical, or does it? That's kind of one of the mysteries of the movie. Is this allegory or is it reality? And what is reality? That's a big piece of what I think makes the movie so fascinating, such a fun and compelling watch. Fun is maybe the wrong word. I don't know that I'd call The Babadook fun, but I definitely call it good and very compelling. It's a gripping movie. And it has an ending that I think is so meaningful and so beautiful that I obviously will not spoil here, but it really hit for me. It was a moving ending to a rather emotional movie. And that's, I guess, the thing that I would kind of give you guys a heads up about if you haven't seen it. It is an emotional movie. It is a challenging film, not in terms of like, oh, it's a tough watch. It's not like a Count of a Holocaust type thing or something like that. It's just if you've ever experienced loss or grief like this might be a triggering movie. I don't know, but it'll hit for you. But I don't think you shouldn't watch it. I definitely think you should check it out because it is an exceptionally made, exceptionally performed film, exceptionally written film. It really is above. It really is a cut above. It really does stand out as something special in the horror genre and the elevated horror subgenre too. Now, one kind of funny side note to this is the Babadook movie and the creature have become something of like a gay icon. I guess as the story goes, there was an image that went viral on social media of a Netflix queue. Somebody took a picture of their Netflix queue, and it had the gay themed movies, and the Babadook was listed there. And if you've seen the Babadook, and this is not really a spoiler, there really doesn't seem to be any real gay themes or LGBTQ themes going on in the movie. I guess maybe you could make an argument for that. I don't know. I'd have to hear the argument, and I think people have made the argument. Some people think that this was a prank or a joke. Some people just think it was some sort of algorithm goof on Netflix's part, or maybe Netflix's algorithm is really really diving deep into the text of the Babadook. I don't know, but for whatever reason, the Babadook became kind of the gay community claimed the Babadook and had a lot of fun with it. At the gay pride parades, they'd have like pictures of the Babadook on signs and stuff. In fact, so much I think maybe Scream Factory, I think it was, released a Blu-ray of it. There was like a gay edition of it. It had like the Babadook picture with the rainbow on it. This is indicative of nothing other than just kind of finding it a funny story that the gay community has gravitated to this movie so much, and I do kind of wonder if there is an allegory to be drawn or some themes to be kind of mined out of the story of the Babadook that speak to LGBT issues, LGBTQ issues, because I'd be curious to hear about that. So if you do have insight into that, by all means, please enlighten us all in the comments because I'd find that fascinating. I actually thought about putting this in the LGBTQ video when we get to that subgenre, but I honestly don't see the themes there. So I chose not to do that in favor of talking about some other movies, but I wanted to put it here because I do think it is a wonderful example of elevated horror. It's the best of what the subgenre has to offer, and why I like this subgenre and why I want to include this subgenre rather than try to say it doesn't really exist or something like that. So by all means, check out the Babadook if you haven't. And the last movie that we're talking about today, our postgraduate level movie, it's Midsommar or Midsommar. Nobody seems to be able to make up their mind about this. I'm gonna go ahead and stick with Midsommar because it's just, I don't know, it rolls off my tongue a little easier, I guess. But Midsommar, if you prefer, I don't think it really matters. Midsommar came out in 2019, came out fairly recently, and it's the second movie from Ari Aster, who directed the brilliant Hereditary, which we've talked about already in a previous video. I loved Hereditary when it came out. I thought it was amazing. One of the best horror movies I've seen in a long time. So when Midsommar came out and is from the same director, I had extremely high expectations. And also, just viewing the trailer, it looked like the kind of movie that was going to be up my alley. The movie did not disappoint. If you haven't seen Midsommar, it's a movie about a young woman whose family dies under tragic circumstances, and while she's grieving them, she goes and accompanies her boyfriend and his friends to Sweden to a commune that is one of the men came from, and they have a different way of living their lives, and it seems idyllic, but under the surface there seem to be some problems. And as usual, we stop there so we don't spoil things. The movie is incredible, and it goes into some really insane places. So, a few things right off the bat to get out of the way. The movie's gorgeous. It looks incredible. It's very rare to see a lot of daylight scenes in a horror movie, especially scary scenes in the daylight. And the reason for this is obvious, right? That we're more afraid of the dark. What you can't see is creepier. The more you can see something, the more knowledge you have of something, the less scary it is. So it's hard to make things scary in the daytime. Midsommar doesn't care. Like it goes, most of the movie is in bright daylight, and it is incredibly effective. It works extremely well. The movie also has some incredibly shocking moments of violence and gore. I mean, really disturbing, and they come out of nowhere and they punch you square in the gut. So those are two things that probably get mentioned a lot when people talk about this movie. And they are very noteworthy. They are two things that make this movie stand out. Two of the things that I think make the movie elevated horror. Another thing, though, about the movie that doesn't maybe get talked about as much, but really should, is the acting performances. Once again, across the board, you've got phenomenal performances anchored by your lead, Florence Pugh. Now, many of you are about to become familiar with Florence Pugh when this Black Widow movie comes out, if it ever comes out. But she is phenomenal. She got nominated recently for an Oscar for her work in Little Women, and she was incredible in that. But this, to me, is the movie that really shows you just how good she actually can be. I feel like she's tapping into something very real in this movie because her depictions of a woman in pain, like the physical pain that she goes through, over the losses that she's suffered. It's visceral. You can almost feel it through the screen. And that's key because that becomes part of a theme of the movie is sharing the feelings of guilt. Um, the movie tackles these issues like community and faith, uh, grief, mental health, mental illness. Uh, a lot of these things are kind of touched on this movie again in ways that are more entertaining than are heavy. But there is a heaviness to this movie. Don't let me lie to you. But as Ari Aster, the director, has actually stated, what this movie really is exploring is like a toxic relationship, a couple that is bad for each other but too scared to leave each other. uh, this is a bad relationship, and it's obvious that it's a bad relationship to everybody but the couple. They just don't seem to want to leave each other. It's like a fear of loneliness. It's a fear of change. And this movie takes a bad breakup movie, like a romantic comedy bad breakup movie, something like that, and throws in this horror element, and it becomes something wild and unique and fascinating. Um, it's interesting to watch people watch this movie. There are people who've done reaction videos on YouTube, and it's fascinating to watch them watch this because they see the early scenes in this relationship, and they're just like, oh God, this is horrible, but the characters cannot see it. And it's so interesting to see everybody latch onto that and lock onto that, and to see how that sets up a lot of the things that happen later on in the movie. It's masterful work. And what's also fun about this is that the director Ari Aster, he telegraphs so much of where he's going to go in this movie, and yet you miss it until you maybe rewatch it, or even if you kind of cue into it, you're like, oh, this is telling me stuff that's going to happen. You still don't see it coming. When it comes, you're like, oh God, there it is. It's masterful storytelling. Ari Aster is a master storyteller. He has complete control of mood through his lighting and his camera work and his camera angles and his script. Everything is just in control. I mean, the movie's long. It doesn't necessarily feel long, but it's a long movie. It's a slow movie, but you're locked in. You're so hooked on it, and he just holds you right here and kind of toys with you a little bit until he's ready to give you what he wants to give you when he wants to give it to you. I love that. I love a director that can just take you on that ride and just kind of, that emotional journey, that emotional roller coaster, and just kind of ride you out and make you just so satisfied by the end of the movie. He did it with Hereditary. He's done it with Midsommar, and I cannot wait to see what he does next. Because this guy, right out the gate, is showing himself to be a master filmmaker. And I mean, I'm maybe people will think I'm being hyperbolic here, but I mean like Kubrick level master filmmaker. So, I'll dial it down a little bit till we see what else he does with his work. But so far, phenomenally impressed with what he's been able to do. Now, like some of the other movies we've talked about, this movie could have gone under many other categories or subgenres of films. It could have been a religious movie. It could have been a family dysfunction movie. It could have been cult movie. It's not really much of a spoiler to tell you. When you see the trailer, you're going to zero right in on it. Themes of movies like The Wicker Man will come to mind. And that's kind of reinforcing the point I was making at the beginning of this video, is that these elevated horror movies are also other horror movies, and other horror movies are potentially elevated horror. It doesn't necessarily be one or the other. They can be both. And I think that is a good way of illustrating the value of elevated horror is movies like this that really do have the kind of flexibility to be many different things and tackle many different subgenres, but at the same time present something that feels very highbrow, very smart, very moving, very noteworthy, very important. And I do think this movie is successful in that regard. If you haven't seen it, I would recommend that you check it out. Like I said, there is some stuff to be wary of in terms of trigger warning things, but not necessarily the easiest watch for some people, but it's beautifully made, wonderfully acted. Just the quality and impact of this movie is so good, and the ending of the movie is incredible. So it's a high recommend for me. I definitely want to have other people see it and enjoy it. And if you have seen it, let us know what you thought about it in the comments, because I'm effusive about it, so I'm a little bit biased, I suppose. So if you have a different take on it, share it in the comments. Let us know if I'm being a little too hyperbolic in praising in praising Midsommar or Midsommar. So those are our three picks for the elevated horror subgenre, but I've got a few extra credit movies to check out that I think you'll find pretty interesting. The first extra credit movie on our list is The Lighthouse. And if ever there was a movie that epitomized the polarizing controversy of elevated horror, it's The Lighthouse. The Lighthouse, for those of you who aren't familiar, is a story about two men tasked with running a lighthouse. It's a period piece, and they get stuck there and slowly start to go insane. And it is a polarizing film. There are people who absolutely love this movie and think it's genius, and then there's people who absolutely despise this movie and think it's garbage. I probably fall somewhere in between on this one, but I'll get to that in a second. The movie is made by Robert Eggers, and Robert Eggers, he made the movie The Witch, which we haven't talked about yet, and you'll notice didn't get mentioned in this video. It's because it's going to get mentioned in another video very, very soon. But we'll get to that then. For now, let's focus on The Lighthouse. The Lighthouse is, I talked earlier about art house films and movies being kind of arty. The Lighthouse kind of cranks that up to 11. It's in black and white. It's got a kind of a, I don't know if it's a 4:3 aspect ratio or kind of like a, the Zack Snyder Justice League aspect ratio, but it's more square. And I don't think that adds a tremendous amount to the movie, but and it's got some really bizarre imagery in it. I actually liked the imagery quite a bit. That's maybe one of my favorite things about the movie. And it's got these performances by Willem Dafoe and Robert Pattinson that are quite good and quite over the top and insane, and that fits the movie to a degree. But it's also really bizarre. The tone of the movie is strange. And I think that's where I land on this, is like I had a hard time getting into it. I can see the themes that they were trying to tackle, themes of isolation and insanity and even homosexuality. I can see the themes that are there. I guess I didn't feel like it really landed on something interesting to say about those themes. And the wild imagery, the almost Lovecraftian imagery that would come up was fascinating, really interesting, but it never really seemed to me like it quite came together. And it's a bit of a slow burn movie. It looks great. It's acted great. I just feel like the script is a little bit more vague than I would have liked it to be. And I think that a lot of people who dislike this movie feel like it's pretentious. They feel like it's talking down to them. And I think that is enhanced by people who love it dismissing the people who didn't love it by saying, you just don't get it or you just don't understand it, which I feel is a little dismissive, to be honest with you. I think you can get a movie and not like it that much. I feel like I, for the most part, got this movie. I understand the themes that are being explored here. I just don't feel like they're saying that much. I don't feel like the movie is wasting my time. I didn't hate it. But I would probably not be very keen to go back and revisit it. I can understand why this movie is kind of the poster child for elevated horror and the debate about whether or not it's valid. Because a lot of people who dislike this movie think that it's just kind of like almost like a prank being played on. Like this is just a nonsense movie that is, just self-important. And the people who love this movie just feel like the people who are hating on it just don't appreciate it because they don't understand it. And maybe both of those things are a little bit true. Like I said, I find myself kind of somewhere in the middle on this. I do feel like I understand it. I do feel like I can appreciate what it's trying to do. I don't feel like it accomplishes it. I definitely don't think that it measures up to the impact that the Witch had. I think the Witch landed much harder in terms of impact. I do think from a quality standpoint, from a filmmaking standpoint, they are on par. They're both beautifully made, slavishly detailing the period piece, really getting that dialogue down correctly to the point where it might help to watch it with subtitles, frankly. So there's a lot about the movie to be appreciated from a filmmaking standpoint, from an acting standpoint, from an image standpoint. Uh, but is it a satisfying movie? I didn't feel very satisfied from it. I felt wanting after watching this, especially because I had heard about it so much by the time I got to it. It had gotten so much praise. I had higher expectations that weren't quite met. I also don't think it quite deserves the vitriol that it gets either, though. I think that people who dislike it maybe can just kind of write it off as like, hey, it's just not for me. I like my horror a little bit more accessible, a little bit less esoteric or allegorical. It's the same thing that people say about David Lynch movies, and we're going to talk about David Lynch quite a bit in the future. But David Lynch isn't for everybody, and I'd say that the Lighthouse isn't for everybody. So that's how I chalk it up. So take what I've said and maybe do a little research before deciding if you want to sit down and watch it if you're on the fence about it. But it's definitely got to be mentioned here, at least as extra credit, because from elevated horror it kind of stands out as one of the examples. The next extra credit movie I want to talk about is The Lodge. And The Lodge got a lot of buzz. Came out recently, and it stars Riley Keough as a woman who is getting engaged to a man who has two young children. And those young children don't like her very much. They favor their mother, who recently passed away. And they all go off to this lodge to celebrate Christmas and get snowed in. And that's where we'll leave it. So as not to spoil things, but the lodge got a lot of hype. Just like the Lighthouse, a lot of people were talking about the lodge when it came out. But in this time I actually felt like the buzz was warranted. This movie lived up to my expectations when I saw it. I came in a little late on it, but I really, really, really liked this movie a lot. Riley Keough plays the main character, and for those of you who don't know, she's Elvis's granddaughter. And she's brilliant in this movie, and she's been doing some really good work for a while now, including some horror work. She's in the movie Jack and Diane that's quite good. She's in a TV show that was on Showtime, I believe. It's called The Girlfriend Experience, based on the Steven Soderbergh film, where she plays a call girl, and really, really good in that TV show as well. So Riley Keough is somebody who I think is just itching to break out, and this is the movie that really shows you just how good she can be as the woman who's dealing with a lot of issues. And that's what this movie is trying to tackle, is some of those themes of grief and isolation, and the family dynamic. The blended family dynamic is another theme that's being tackled in this movie, again, in ways that are very interesting and gripping and spooky, but also dealing with real world issues that are very true. Like, there's a lot of people who experience like the new wife or the new husband coming in, and how that upsets the apple cart of the family dynamic. And this movie can explore that in a way that also, with the fun horror aspects to it, makes it more of a ride rather than a slog. The actors playing the kids are really, really good as well. Alicia Silverstone makes an appearance. If you like Alicia Silverstone, which I do, it's a welcome appearance. In fact, it was kind of funny. I was watching this movie, and my wife loves Alicia Silverstone, and she saw her, and she's like, "Oh, should I be watching this movie?" I'm like, no, because A, it's a horror movie and you don't like that, and B, I don't think Alicia Silverstone's going to be here for very long. And she's not. And that's not really a spoiler if you know the premise of the movie. But the movie it goes some places that I didn't expect, and I really, really, really enjoyed it quite a bit. I do think that it explores these themes of grief and mental illness really, really well, in a really compelling way. There's a mystery going on that is pretty fun. I'll be honest, like, I could kind of see where the movie was going, but that didn't diminish it at all. I still really enjoyed the ride. I really enjoyed the performances. It's filmed beautifully. The location is fabulous. Everything from this movie worked for me really, really well. Can't praise it enough. I do think, I'll be honest, it missed making the syllabus just because the syllabus was pretty much kind of set by the time I saw it. And so, I couldn't figure out a way to shoehorn it in, so that's where it winds up here in extra credit. But it made a good case for getting on the syllabus proper. So really enjoyed The Lodge. Definitely recommend it if you haven't seen it. And the last extra credit movie we're going to talk about today is Personal Shopper. And Personal Shopper is also a recent movie that came out. And this is one, it stars Kristen Stewart as a woman who is a personal shopper for a famous actress or model. I think she's a model. but she's unhappy doing that, and she's still doing it because she's coping with the recent death of her twin brother. um, and so she's kind of exploring his recent death in Paris, and she considers herself a medium, and so she's trying to get a sign from him. I think that's not telling too much about the movie. The movie is something of more of a drama than a horror film. There's definitely horror aspects to this movie. There is, you know, ghost aspects to it, and other like other aspects that I don't want to get into because I don't want to spoil the movie. So it definitely is a horror movie. I definitely think you can call it a horror movie, but you could easily make this a drama. Just as well, and it would be an excellent movie. In fact, I think that's another trope of elevated horror movies, is that a lot of them could just be dramas if you just extracted the horror elements, and they would work really well. This is a great example of that. This movie really is focused on one woman dealing with the loss of her twin brother, and that grief, and again, you know, some mental health issues kind of weaved into that storyline, and it's a beautiful movie. It really is this wonderful allegory for how people deal with grief and loss. And I love it. Again, I can't go too much into it without spoiling it. I don't want to spoil it because there's an air of mystery to this movie that works really, really well. Um, but it's a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful film, and it plays out kind of slowly, but I think that mystery and that sense of just kind of weird uneasiness that permeates the film carries you through it. That and Kristen Stewart, who is phenomenal in this movie. We've talked about her a couple times already. I know most people just focus on the Twilight movies. Forget about that. She really is a brilliant actress, and this is a movie that should convince you of that. If Underwater didn't already get you on the Kristen Stewart train, this movie should, because she's so good in this movie. And people might argue that she's kind of playing herself. She's kind of got that cool aloof thing going on that she does, but it really suits this movie, and it suits the themes of this movie. And she really is able to convey so much. So much of the movie is just her on screen by herself, and she really conveys so much with a look or with her body language. Brilliant performance, and it anchors this movie. It really does go into some interesting places, and it has an ending that I think might be a polarizing ending. I personally loved the ending. I mean, to the point where, like, I wanted to applaud it. But I've seen that other people find the ending to be kind of frustrating, so be forewarned about that. But I do think that people maybe have some differing opinions in this movie. I don't know how well received this was. I know that it went to a film festival circuit. I think it might have gone to Cannes, and maybe it was booed at first and then praised later. I'm not quite clear on it, but I'll just talk from my own personal experience. I think the movie's absolutely wonderful. Again, maybe more drama than horror, fair enough, but I do think it's a wonderful example of elevated horror. I think it's tackling those themes. I think that it really conveys an artistic, deep, meditative look at something that is, yeah, maybe smarter than, you know, Leprechaun 4, for sure. But it's just really a really beautifully made movie, beautifully acted movie, very nuanced performance, very nuanced story, really powerful movie. I love it. I think it's fantastic. Highly recommend it. And the only reason it's not on the syllabus is because, again, it's arguably not even horror. There's horror elements to it, but, you know, and you know, take with that what you will. But if you haven't seen it, I would definitely recommend checking it out. And I'd be curious to see your thoughts on it if you have checked it out. So as usual, leave comments below if you have. But yeah, I love Personal Shopper, and I would definitely recommend you check it out too. So that's going to do it for our video today. Thank you guys very much for attending. I know this one was a bit of a longer one, but I'm kind of passionate about this subgenre, or really not so much the subgenre, but the movies in the subgenre. And I think that's maybe the takeaway here is whether you like the term elevated horror or not, the movies, I think everybody can agree, are good movies, if not great movies. So maybe we don't need to fight over the term and just say, hey, these movies are great. If you don't want to have an elevated horror subgenre, throw it out. Shuffle these movies into other subgenres. Most, if not all of them, fit into other subgenres. So have a blast. You know, when you guys are filling out your own syllabus, put them in other places. Cross out the elevated horror subgenre. I empower you to modify that as you see fit. But thank you very much for coming with me on this journey as we explored the elevated horror subgenre and the controversies that surround it. I appreciate your attendance, and I appreciate everything you guys have been doing, both in terms of supporting the channel and in your comments. It means a lot to me. So with that, we'll call it a day. Class dismissed.